As kids, I think we all dream of becoming a professional athlete at some point. Standing on a podium, winning a championship, celebrating with our team, feeling that immense sense of euphoria. And for me, when I was a kid, I always dreamt of being a professional figure skater. So much so that when my elementary school teachers asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would emphatically answer, I want to be a professional figure skater. And they probably laughed and rolled their eyes, but I think for me, I always knew that I was going to make that happen. Now, by the time I was 13 in 2006, I had ended up making the decision to write my 4-year plan of goals. Thanks to my mom for holding on to that for the past 13 years. And you can ignore my terrible handwriting. But I had watched the 2006 Winter Olympic Games in Torino, and that had completely inspired me, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my skating career. Now, if we zoom in to my goals for the 2009 and 2010 season, I said I wanted to make it to the Olympics. And 4 years later, I won my first national championship. I walked in the opening ceremonies, and I competed at the Olympics and gave 2 perfect performances. I was on top of the world, and I was so excited. And I couldn't believe this was happening. I had 2 standing ovations, and I felt the electricity in the building. And all of the 14 years of 40-hour training weeks, all of the sacrifices that I had made and that my parents had made felt like they had paid off. I felt that sense of euphoria. But 2 minutes later, I received my marks, and I was devastated and heartbroken with tears streaming down my face. You see, I hadn't received credit for 2 of my most important elements in my program, which dropped me out of medal contention, and I ended up finishing 7th. I was devastated, and I felt like I had completely failed myself, my team, and my country in the fact that I was one of only 2 U.S. figure skaters in that event. Now, a couple months ago, I was talking to one of my really good friends, and she said, gosh, at 17, you seem to have it all. You made it to the Olympics, you graduated the top of your class in high school, and you made it into your dream school at Stanford. What does that feel like now that your life's all downhill from there? I, of course, laughed it off in the moment. But it got me thinking, gosh, what had happened in those 5 years after the Olympics? I struggled with a number of injuries, and unfortunately, I really struggled with balancing my academics at Stanford and my sport. And I never ended up making another Olympic team. So at 21, in 2015, I decided to make the decision to retire from competitive skating. And in that moment, this pillar of my identity had been knocked out from underneath me. I no longer knew who I was, and I didn't know what I wanted. So much for all those goals that I had written down. It didn't matter anymore. I was no longer a figure skater. And I felt incredibly lost, and none of my peers who had competed in sports over the years had told me to expect this feeling of loss. And in that moment, I was incredibly depressed and isolated. And I think for the next 6 months, I would have believed my friend, and that maybe my life had been at its peak at 17, and it really was all downhill from there. So a lot of athletes in recent years have stepped forward to talk about their experience in transitioning out of sport. Michael Phelps even has talked about his crippling anxiety and depression as a result of making the decision to take a step back from swimming before he came back and won a zillion gold medals in Rio, of course. But, you know, I think most of us put athletes on this pedestal, and we couldn't imagine the greatest swimmer of all time dealing with these problems. You know, but at the end of the day, he's just another person struggling with this tremendous sense of loss and figuring out how to take the next steps forward. So we have these very critical points in our lives. We're making these tremendous life transitions. Retirement from sport, retirement from a job, making that transition from high school to college. And those times make us more susceptible to developing mental health disorders. In addition to that, we also have genetic and environmental factors that contribute to our risk of developing mental health disorders like anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. Some of those common factors in terms of your environment and your genetics are your gender, your personality traits like neuroticism, social influences like negative peer pressure, and adverse events that occur while you're a child. Now, in sports, we deal with those same global environmental factors. But in addition to that, we have unique sport-specific risk factors. So for me, my skating environment, while it made me more resilient in the end, ended up being something that was really harmful to me. It was a very difficult environment to be in for a number of years for a variety of reasons. Now, I wasn't your typical figure skater for a number of reasons, but the main reason was because I didn't have the typical body type of an elite athlete. Now, in skating, we value thinness and this almost waif-like figure on top of being really toned. That's the stereotype in skating. And for me, I just looked like your average kid next door. I was healthy, strong, and fit, but I certainly didn't look like an elite athlete. And as a result, I received a ton of body shaming comments over the years. I had coaches tell me, well, gosh, it'd be so much easier for you to get through your programs if you weren't skating with that sack of potatoes on your body. I even had them tell me that my flow and my speed across the ice would be so much better if I dropped 10 pounds by the competition next week and the judges will score you better. From judges, I was told, well, you really shouldn't eat any carbs in front of us while we're in the dining hall together at events. And even fans and spectators had the audacity to call me Big Bird when I wore a yellow dress, and one even came up to me and said, looked me up and down and said, gosh, it looks like you're having too much fun at college. Those comments were so harmful to me, but I was so thankful that I had such a strong support system in place that advocated for my health and my wellness over success. I think any of those comments could have easily turned me to an eating disorder, but fortunately, with their support, I was able to prioritize my mental and physical health over success. Now, when we're looking at a lot of other athletes, we've had many step forward recently and talk about their experiences in sports and how it's contributed to their mental health. From Michael Phelps to Allie Reisman, who has recently spoke about her struggles with body shaming in gymnastics, and even the emotional turmoil and trauma as a result of being sexually abused by a physician, Larry Nassar. One of my peers, Gracie Gold, has talked about her experience with an eating disorder and depression in figure skating. And we constantly have football players stepping forward and talking about their depression and behavioral issues that have come as a result of the very nature of their sport and the chronic traumatic encephalopathy that results. So we have this incredibly high-risk group of athletes who are at risk because of their environmental factors and these transitional points in their lives. And yet this is compounded by systematic issues where we're unable to access mental health care providers when we so desperately need it. The American Journal of Preventive Medicine recently published an article demonstrating that we have 30 psychologists and 15 psychiatrists per 100,000 people. About half of us are estimated to develop a mental health problem during our lifetime. And so when you need that help, you may not be able to access that person. On top of it, it's costly and it's hard to access them. Sometimes in rural places, you don't have a mental health care provider in your community. Now in sports, we see the same thing. If you take a look at college sports, for instance, we have about one mental health care provider per athletic department, if we're lucky. And that person could be treating over 900 athletes at once. Yeah, so even when you want to go get treatment, you may not be able to. Now, on top of that, in sports, we also have additional systematic issues in that we have incredible pressures on our time. We have very little time when we're traveling at events to go get treatment. And on top of that, there's a much more elevated stigma for getting mental health care treatment in athletes compared to non-athletes. So it's no wonder that we have athletes who really aren't getting the treatment that they need. So our problem is that we have this group of folks who are incredibly high risk, and they're very likely to develop mental health disorders because of the environment, because of their transitional time points, and we have no system in place to really help them. So now that we know we have these issues, we're just talking about it. We aren't taking action yet. And we know that mental health significantly impacts mental performance and physical performance, and yet nothing is being done at this point in time. We have about 45 million kids every year who participate in sports. So it's time that we change that. Now, what I'm really excited about is what I'm starting to work on here at UNC in my PhD program in clinical psychology. A lot of what we're doing is trying to transform the culture of mental health by using digital mental health tools and leveraging technology. So I'll give you an idea of some of the things that we're working on. For instance, we're taking online assessments. We're able to use even social media to identify when people are at risk or when they're engaging in unhealthy behaviors that might put them at severe risk of developing a mental health disorder. On top of that, we're taking the active ingredients of face-to-face treatment and placing those into online and app-based programs, and we're seeing the same efficacy for anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, both in terms of treatment and prevention. One of the studies that I'm currently working on leverages smartwatches. So we're gathering active data from an application and passive data from the Apple Watch, where we're able to look at heart rate, activity, and location, and we're able to predict when people are at risk for engaging in these unhealthy behaviors like binge eating and purging. Now, once we're able to do that, we can actually provide interventions before people engage in those behaviors, period, which would completely transform how we treat mental health problems. So what I'm doing here at UNC now, that we know that some of these digital tools help, is starting to tailor them not only for specific mental health disorders, but for these populations that clearly have unique needs. And what I'm pretty excited about is that, given the experiences that I've had in sports, that it can be the highest high and also the lowest low. We'll be able to use these technology-based tools, completely change how we're supporting our athletes, how we're changing the environment of sport, and these transitional points in our lives. So when I was 13, I told you that I wanted to make the Olympic team, and now I can say I've officially checked that off my list. But after having these experiences in my life and seeing how they've flowed together and how they're interconnected, and I'm now seeing the culmination of these things in my life for my future research, I have a new goal to share with you. My new goal is to completely transform how we treat the mental health culture in sports and in our communities more broadly. And I hope we can do that together. Thank you.